8. The Six Swans and the 7 Ravens. I would like to discuss two stories together because in both there is the motif of the sister who redeems her brothers, turned in one case into swans and in the other into ravens. Synopsis of the Six Swans. A widow king loses his way when hunting in a large wood, and an old woman with a nodding head that says that she will show him the way out, on condition that he marries her daughter. The king agrees, but has a very bad feeling about the new wife, and therefore hides his children, 6 boys and 1 girl from his previous marriage, in a lonely castle where he often visits them. In order not to lose his way, he uses a ball of cotton given him by a wise woman, by which, like the thread of Ariadne, he is able from time to time to get to the castle. But the inquisitive queen gets suspicious and finds out what he is doing, and, having learned magic arts from her mother, makes some fine silken shirts, into each of which she sews a charm. Then, with the help of the same cotton ball, she follows the king and finds the 6 boys. The girl is out at the moment, but the boys, seeing in the distance someone coming, think it's their father and run joyfully to meet him. And she throws the shirts over them, and immediately they are changed into swans and fly away over the forest. The next day the king comes to visit the children and asks the girl where her brothers are. She tells her father how she saw them being changed into swans. The king, fearing that the girl might also be bewitched, wants to take her home. But since the girl is afraid of her stepmother, she asks to be allowed to spend 1 more night in the castle. Then she goes to speak to her brothers. After a long journey through the wood, she finds a small, miserable hut in which are 6 little beds. She creeps in under one, and just as the sun is setting, the 6 white swans come in at the window and begin blowing on one another until their swan's down is stripped off like a shirt, and the brothers and sister meet each other joyfully. But the brothers tell her that it is a robber's hiding place, and that, if the robbers return and find her, they will murder her. The boys explain that they themselves can only lay aside their swan feathers for a quarter of an hour each evening. The sister asks how she can redeem them, and they tell her that for the next 6 years she must neither speak nor laugh, and during that time she must sew 6 little shirts made from star flowers, then throw them over the swans. So the girl resolves to rescue her brothers. She leaves the cottage and, penetrating further into the woods, collects star flowers, and then goes and sits up in a tree and begins to make shirts. After she has passed some time there, a king, when hunting one day, finds her and asks her who she is. She does not reply, but first throws down her gold necklace, and then her girdle, and afterward her rich dress in an effort to make him desist. But she is so beautiful that the king's heart is touched, and he falls so much in love with her that he takes her home and marries her. Then comes the classical motif, for the young king has a wicked mother, now the girl's mother-in-law. When the queen gives birth to a child, the mother-in-law hides it and accuses the queen of having murdered it. This happens 3 times. The 3rd time, the king is obliged to let his wife be tired, and she is condemned to be burned as a witch. But just as when the sentence is to be carried out, the time has elapsed, and the 6 swans fly over. The girl quickly throws the shirts she has brought with her over the birds, and the brothers stand up alive and well, but 1 shirt she has not had time to finish, so that the youngest brother keeps a swan's wing instead of his left arm. The queen can now tell what happened. The wicked stepmother is condemned to be burned on the scaffold, and the 3 children who had been hidden away are returned to the court. Synopsis of the 7 Ravens. A man had 7 sons, and when at last a daughter was born, she was so weak and small that he decided to baptize her at once, as otherwise she would not go to heaven if she died. The father sent one of his sons hastily to a spring to fetch water for the baptism. But the boys all ran together, and because each strove to be the first to fill the pitcher, between them it got broken. The father first became impatient, saying that the boys were good-for-nothing youths and had forgotten all about the water while playing games. Then he became anxious lest the child should die unbaptized, and in his haste said, "I would they were all changed into ravens." Then he became anxious lest the child should die unbaptized, and in his haste said, "I would they were all changed into ravens." He had scarcely finished speaking when he heard a whirring over his head, and looking up, he saw 7 coal-black ravens flying over the house. The parents, who could not revoke the curse, grieved very much for their lost sons, but comforted themselves in some measure with their little daughter, who grew strong and more beautiful every day. The girl, however, overheard people saying that she was certainly very beautiful, but that the guilt of her 7 brothers rested on her head. This made her very sad, and she went to her parents and learned what had happened. Then she set out on a long journey to the world's end to redeem the boys. All she took with her was a ring belonging to her parents for remembrance, a loaf of bread to satisfy her hunger, a bottle of water to drink, and a little stool for moments of weariness. First on her journey she came to the sun, but it was hot and fearful and burned up little children. Then she ran to the moon, but that was cold and wicked looking, and said, I smell a man's flesh." So she ran away quickly and came to the stars, which were friendly and kind to her, and allowed her to stop and rest. Each star was sitting upon its own little seat, except the morning star, who was standing up and gave her a crooked bone and said, "If you have not this bone, you cannot unlock the glass castle where your brothers are." The girl wrapped up the bone in her handkerchief and went on, but when she arrived at the glass castle, she discovered, to her horror, that she had lost the crooked bone, so she cut off her little finger and used that to unlock the door. A dwarf came to the door, and she told him that she was seeking her 7 brothers. He replied that they were not at home, but that she should come in and sit down and wait. He then carried in the food for the 7 ravens upon 7 dishes and in 7 cups. The girl ate a little bit off each dish and drank a little out of each cup, but into the last cup she dropped the ring she had brought with her. The ravens came in and prepared to eat and drink, and noticed that a human had been there, for someone had eaten out of their dishes and drunk out of their cups. But when the 7th came to the bottom of his cup, the little ring rolled out, which he recognized as his parents, and he said, "God grant that our sister is here, then we are saved." When the maiden who stood behind the door heard these words, she came out, and immediately all the ravens received their human form again, and embraced and kissed their sister, and they all went happily home together. First, there is an interesting little variation as far as the number of symbolism is concerned. There are 6 swans and 7 ravens, but if we look at the end of the story, we find that in both cases there are 8 people. In one story there are the king and queen and the 6 redeemed swans, and in the other the sister does not marry, so there are again 8. Thus, however it stands, at the end there are 8, which we can say in both cases has to do with the famous problem of the relationship of 7 to 8. It is the variation of the 3 to 4 problem, which plays such an important role in number symbolism. From Jung's commentary on dreams in the first part of Psychology and Alchemy, we know that the step from 3 to 4, the assimilation of the 4th function, is a very difficult stage in psychological evolution. The 7th to the 8th would be a differentiation of the same problem, because the dangerous step from 3 to 4 can be divided into 7 to 8, and then only half a step must be made. By taking it in 2 parts, it is a little bit easier. So the numbers 7 and 8 show a more differentiated approach to the problem of evil and the inferior function. In number symbolism, 7 is usually regarded as the number of an evolutionary process, as for instance in the case of the 7 planets of classical astrology. One could say that the 7 planets were the basic elements of the horoscope, and therefore the archetypal basic elements on which every human personality is built. Everybody has Saturn, Mars, the Moon, etc., but in a different configuration. Everybody has at some point in life to realize these basic elements, though according to the pattern of the horoscope, the way this happens is always different, which led to the idea that the 7 planets had to do with the evolution of the personality. There are also 7 days of the week, and the 7 notes of the octave. Sometimes 7 is the complete number, and sometimes 8, as the return to the first on the higher level, as it would be in the musical octave. The number 7 contains a certain amount of inner tension because it is subdivided into 3 and 4. Jacob Boehm, the mystic who went into a great deal of number symbolism, says that 7 is the tension between the spiritual Holy Trinity above and the 4 elements on earth below. The 8th is the lightning which suddenly connects the two, the 7 calling for the 8th. St. Augustine also speaks of the symbolism of the 7. He says the 6 days of the week correspond to the work of the creation in Genesis, and on the 7th day God rested. That is the day of the Lord. Then you think it stops with the 7, but he adds that these 7 days are still in time, and there is an 8th, which is eternity. So we must count the 8th element, and that would be a not in time element. So 8 carries, like 4, the meaning of the self, the totality aspect. It steps out of the process of evolution into an eternal, static state. In the story of the 6 Swans, the king gets lost in the wood and has to buy his way out by promising to marry the wicked old woman's daughter. The king in general represents the dominating principle of collective consciousness, and in fairy tales he very often is ill or in a difficult situation. The story, therefore, shows the classical situation when the principle of collective consciousness is stuck and lost, and no longer in a leading position, and so cannot function appropriately any longer. It is lost in the woods, in the thick of the unconscious. The king cannot find his way out. One could say that there was black magic at the bottom of it, because the nodding old woman turns up, who had probably bewitched him into getting lost in the first place. She turns out to be an evil form of the Great Mother, for she is the instigating figure in the cursing of the swans. Mechanical nodding is often attributed to demonic figures. There are other fairy stories where the heroine goes into the forbidden chamber and finds in it an evil, nodding skeleton. In a parallel version, she found in the forbidden chamber the figure of the Great Mother, called Maria, the Cursed One. She is sitting on a fiery swing, so either nodding or swinging on a fiery swing is a similar motif. It is a basic archetypal idea that demons have a mechanical swinging movement, expressing a state of non-redemption. Many descriptions of the Greek underworld contain the same image. For instance, Sisyphus, who has eternally to roll the rock uphill, the Danaids, who had to pour water through a sieve, or Tantalus, with the ever-receding water and fruit which he could never reach to drink or eat. There is a meaningless eternal rhythm which nearly leads to the goal, but never quite, and that is the essence of torture, the eternal roundabout of meaninglessness. Thus, such mechanical, eternally repeating movements are in mythology attributed to demons or cursed beings. Psychologically, the motif occurs in psychotic material and expresses something torturing even to the onlooker. There are recurring better phases in which constructive fantasy materials appear. The patient seems to improve, and one feels that positive life movement is building up. But it all crumbles, for just at the decisive moment there is no ego to assimilate the unconscious material. So the ebb and flow, the building up and decomposing, follow in rhythmical procession. But eventually even such movements die down and people petrify and become dumb and stupid, and no inner process seems to go on. It does not seem to reach the surface anymore. This state is mythologically attributed to the effect of the dark side of the Godhead. In Christianity, it is the punishment in hell which God imposes and where the weak and lost souls go. The mother goddess also is said to have this dark aspect, which manifests in this meaningless movement, and it is that which gives the old woman in our story the demonic aspect. Witches frequently have daughters who are beautiful but who, in their character otherwise, are exactly like their mothers. The king marries the witch's daughter, and then his children are tortured by her. But he still has a little sense and smells a rat, and tries to save the children, which is quite unusual, for generally he is caught in the witch marriage, and then the children are persecuted by the stepmother. Here the king removes the children and gets to them by the magic cotton ball, a sort of Ariadne thread, but that does not help. If the dominant principle of collective consciousness is worn out, then the children would represent the promise of the new spirit, the new principle, and this is now removed into the wood by the king himself, but in order to preserve it. The principle of consciousness in a single human being tends to become worn out. Then there is a need for renewal, and this is always a dangerous moment. One fears the breakdown, which is absolutely necessary for renewal. One fears to give up, and to be for a short time faced with nothing. Therefore, cowardice or ambition in the conscious ego tends to cling to the old ways and to prevent the renewal, and so evil gets in. Here this does not happen directly, but because the children are removed, what would that represent? It often happens in individuals when they have reached this dangerous point that they build up a double life. That is, one does not consciously repress the new side, but allows for it in a hidden corner of one's life. For instance, a middle-aged, overworked businessman who has the manager's disease tries to evade a breakdown, becoming more and more neurotic by conducting a hidden affair in a rational way, and allowing for it in a safe little corner where he can live his foolish feelings and the inferior function. He wants to have his cake and eat it too, and to organize things so as to avoid a clash. So on Saturday he goes to his girlfriend, and on Sunday he goes to church, hoping in that way to escape the conflict. Such people begin to get sentimental at the end of the week, but are still reckless sharks the other 5 days. They do something for their other side, but it must be done in the right way, for otherwise it won't work. If what was intended by the unconscious was a breakdown, a complete change of attitude, and not a compromise, the stepmother gets at the children just as though the king had not tried to save them. In a collective conscious situation, this would be a situation where the feminine principle has disappeared in its positive form and has turned evil. The feminine aspect in the whole story is negative. The only woman, except the heroine, is a negative mother figure. The principle of feeling and of nature is no longer recognized. Consciousness is too masculine and too rational, so that the underworld reacts in this negative form. The negative mother principle transforms the king's boys into swans. Before looking at the symbolism of the swan, I want first to discuss the beginning of the 7 ravens. The raven and the swans are both birds of Apollo, and in many ways very similar. In the 7 ravens, the father himself, in a moment of rage, pronounces the curse of his sons, and not the stepmother. It is not the father's conscious ego which acts, but his uncontrolled affect, that is, his negative anima. So it turns out to be the same thing as in the first story, the negative femininity, for he does not mean what he says. The father, if he is not a king, represents the habitual conscious attitude of the people. He has the uncontrolled affect, which brings about the destruction of his sons. The second story is concerned with the Christian problem of baptizing the girl as quickly as possible, for the boys drop the jug when they go to fetch the baptismal water. So the father, in a so-called holy rage, curses his children, for his intention to save the girl's soul does not come out right. Baptism, according to Christian teaching, guarantees the child an immortal soul, and in the Catholic Church, the viso beatifica. If the child is sickly, there can be an emergency baptism, instead of having it on about the 3rd day as usual. If we understand this symbolically as representing the girl's fate, one could say that this girl is likely to have difficulty in getting into the Christian tradition. She is in danger of getting lost from the standpoint of Christian consciousness. The father tries to force on her the old habit, and in so doing, the accident happens. In a way, there is a psychological parallel in the beginning of the first story, for the clinging of consciousness to the old principles and ways start up the evil principle, and suddenly out comes the dark side of the father, whose uncalled for affect falls upon the boys. The boys in one case are turned into swans, and in the other into ravens. A swan is mythologically rich in meaning. The Pocket Dictionary of German Superstitions says that the word swan has the same root as the Latin word sonare, meaning sounding or sound, and referring to the singing swan. The swan is supposed to sing very musically before its death, although this has been denied by most natural scientists. But Brehm points out that when swans become old, they get too weak to dive quickly for their food. Thus they eat less and starve, and are often caught in the ice, not having the strength to go for milder districts. Once caught, they are either eaten by other animals or die slowly from starvation. They seem right to the very end to complain bitterly, giving out a high-pitched cry. This strange cry made by the old swans when dying on the ice is probably the hook for the projection of the swan song. The swan is said to know of its approaching death ahead of time, and is supposed, like many other birds, to be able to foretell the future and the weather. There is a German expression, mir schwant, meaning I have a vague hunch or inspiration or idea as to the future. Because the swan is the bird that knows the future, it is holy to Apollo in Greek mythology and to Jotun in Nordic mythology, and also plays a role in the famous mythological Swan Maiden motif. There are many stories of hunters who find a swan who is really a beautiful woman. For instance, a hunter finds 3 beautiful women bathing, their feather garments cast aside, and he takes away one of the garments so that one woman cannot regain bird form. He then carries her off, but some catastrophe happens, and either she flies off and disappears forever, or he can find her only after a long journey. That is the usual Swan Maiden motif, in which the anima appears first as a white bird, generally as a swan. If, while wandering alone the woods, you meet something odd and are not sure whether it is a hallucination or a real human being, mythology says to look at the feet, for demonic beings have swans or ducks or goose's feet, indicating not a human being but a ghost. In Old England, vows were taken in the name of the swan, so there again the swan was endowed with a holy quality. The swan can be said to represent a spiritual aspect of the unconscious psyche. Like all birds, it represents intuitions and hunches, sudden ideas and feelings which come seemingly from nowhere and fly off again. In the Swan Maiden motif, we have a hunter who is told of a beautiful woman who first appears as a swan. It is a question of how a man can get hold of his anima. He has to know his moods and half-unconscious thoughts, which appear in the background of his consciousness, and he holds on to them so that they cannot just disappear again. By writing down the mood or thought, he takes its volatility away and gives it a human quality. But doing it once is not enough. Even a man who has realized what the anima is can let her slip back into her feather garment and fly out of the window. The same is true for a woman. If we do not watch the animus every day, it returns again to its old bird form. Constant, conscious effort is required to keep these inner entities in their connection with human consciousness, because their natural tendency is to escape. The swan brides will always tend to resume their feather garment and fly away, sometimes with and sometimes without the child. Therefore, negatively, the swan represents the flighty, inhuman quality of the anima, but in human form, she is greater awareness of the unconscious and the possibility of a greater inner realization of eros. If we look at the Swan Maiden story historically, it would refer to the pre-Christian stage. Martin Nick's book, Wotan in German Destiny, speaks of the swan as the natural companion of Wotan. If something which has already been in human consciousness is forced into a swan garment, this means a regression. Contents of the unconscious, once integrated to a certain extent, can, due to deterioration of the conscious attitude, be repressed once more. In the 12th and 13th centuries of the Middle Ages, a beginning of the culture of Eros was expressed among the Germanic peoples by the Christian knights, serving their ladies and wearing arms in their honor, with which went a whole cult of relatedness between man and woman, and of Eros in general. At the same time, alchemy flourished, and not by chance. There was a connection with alchemy with the Minendenste, where probably under Arabic influence the feminine principle had been recognized and attended to. With this went a certain recognition of nature and the body and the problem of matter. On account of the Reformation and the demonic extroversion of the Renaissance, however, this very hopeful beginning and the recognition of the feminine principle again disappeared and rationality stiffened. Even Meister Eckhart was forgotten. Alchemical symbolism lived a bit longer, but the Minendenste disappeared completely. Thus, a most promising psychological attitude and a very important beginning suddenly was repressed through the stiffening of the Christian collective conscious attitude, partly due to the split of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, but also to the technical, rational development which began during the Renaissance. There was, of course, also a positive aspect in the historical progression, but for the development of the anima, it was a regression. We could say the anima was forced back into her swan garment. In our two stories, it is, however, a question not of the anima, but of the animus appearing in a swan or raven form. In spite of their seeming difference, Swan and Raven have much in common, not only in Germanic but also in North American, Indian, and Eskimo mythology. The raven was originally a white bird. In the North American, Indian, and the circumpolar mythologies, it is the great light bringer, a Promethean figure and creator god. When bringing down light and fire to mankind, he got so burned as to become black. In Germanic, and especially in Greek mythology, there are legends which say that ravens were first white, but committed sin and were cursed by Apollo and so became black. It happened also to the crow, looked upon as the raven's wife, who was Coronis, the mother of Asclepios. In the Bible, the raven is an ambiguous bird, for when Noah sent it out from the ark, according to legend, it found land but fed on the corpses and did not return. Noah waited in vain and then sent the dove, which brought back the olive leaf. So the raven, from then on, got a bad mark in the Bible. In an article by Father Hugo Rayner on the heavenly and the earthly spirit, the heavenly spirit is represented by the dove, and the spirit of the devil and the witches by the raven. But since opposites always contain the seed of their own opposite, ravens were also called very pious birds, for they had fed Elijah and also St. John at Patmos. There's always a strange kind of double thinking about the symbolism of black and white. The French word for white, blanque, and the German word blanc have the same root, which means shining, clear, and could apply to the shining black or shining white surface. Psychologically, this is not difficult to understand as the secret identity of extreme opposites. As soon as an opposite reaches its extreme form, it turns into its own contrast. From that angle, you could say that the raven represents dark thoughts and also a sudden illumination in your mind. The bird in general symbolizes the involuntary concepts and ideas that suddenly possess us. We think we have them, but really, they alight on our heads. It is not my thought because I have not yet thought it over. It just came to me. It is pre-conscious awareness of something. To catch it, which consists of a critical assimilation of the thought. In dreams, ravens generally appear as thoughts with a melancholy tinge, sad thoughts. You have probably seen pictures painted by depressed people that show a dark wood, a desert, a stormy sea, or black birds everywhere, and which refer to the sad, depressing thoughts one has in such a condition. I am nobody and I will never get better, never get anywhere, etc. The raven is therefore a destructive bird, but it is also God's messenger, because there is such a thing as a creative depression. If you admit those black thoughts, if you say, yes, perhaps I am nobody, but in what sense? You can dialogue with the unconscious. A depression is best overcome by going into it, not fighting it. The radio and the Reader's Digest only make it worse. It is much better to let such black thoughts come up and to dialogue with them. Then very often they become the bread bringers and connect us with God. A depression is really meant to reconnect one with the divine principle. The hermits went voluntarily into a depression and introverted with it, which meant not knowing anything anymore and being quite stranded. In such a condition, the depressing thoughts bring the divine bread, which explains why the raven has a strange double aspect in mythology. Rational consciousness needs to be dimmed by a depression in order that the new light may be found, with new creative possibilities. Taking up a connection with a Swan Maiden would mean a possibility for a man to develop his eros. In our two stories, however, it is a woman who takes up contact with her Swan and Raven brothers. Seen from a feminine angle, this would mean that the heroine takes up a connection with officially rejected thoughts. A woman's mind is usually closer to nature in its negative and positive forms. In the average world of the press and science, what is generally rejected in official thought and scientific and religious subjects is often picked up by women. Since they take matters of the mind less seriously, they have the great advantage of being freer and more flexible, because if a thing is not so important, then why not look at it in a detached way? The following instance has always struck me as a classical example of the difference in the working of a woman's and a man's mind. I once told a professor of electronics about a parapsychological phenomena in which 3 times a glass broke by itself before somebody died. The professor went up in the air and said that that was just chance. I held to my point, and he suddenly looked at me and said that if I was right, then he would shoot himself. I said that that was very narrow-minded, and why should we not investigate the question? He did not have to accept it, but he said that he had taught so many generations that the thing was such and such, and that everything else was unscientific nonsense, that he could not survive any change. That was an honorable reaction. The man stood for what he taught, and that is the best kind of scientist and teacher. He has substance, and for him what is true and what is not true stands. In a woman it would have meant a silly ominous stiffening. A woman's ultimate convictions are in the realm of love and its problems. In science she is freer. Change in her scientific ideas is not a question of life or death. She can say, let's look at the thing and check up on it and see if it works, and if so we can accept it. Which explains why when new movements come up, women are often the first to join them. Men take longer to turn to new contents and ideas, but women are more relaxed about them and can have a very positive effect upon the man by bringing him to a more flexible attitude. They act as a femmes inspiratrices and have a fertilizing effect upon him through their free and creative play attitude. In many civilizations there is the priestess, generally a mediumistic seeress, the woman who can sniff the wind and know what the weather will be. In our story, the heroine has to bring back into the human community something which had been in it, that is, her bewitched brothers, and that task has to be fulfilled by neither talking nor laughing for 6 years and by sewing star shirts. The star shirts against the witch's shirt is the recipe by which the girl can redeem her brothers. Enchantment and disenchantment are often achieved in fairy tales by covering with a garment or an animal skin, the wolf skin, etc. There are also many fairy tales where the witch garment or animal skin has to be quickly removed. A skin or garment indicates the modus or the way in which one appears, or it can be the mask or the persona, a skin or garment under which you hide. I can appear as I am or differently from what I want to show the world. The naked truth is the idea that at the bottom of many mystical ceremonies in which the participants appear naked. On the other hand, a garment can also be the true expression of what one is, the way one manifests to his human view. Probably most people feel sometimes that they are some vague mass of thoughts and actions, and it is a difficult task to express and make it recognizable to others. If you have, for instance, an affect, you have to express it. Although there are certain introverts who think the other person should be clever enough to guess. Such people live beneath an animal skin. They have no modus by which they can express what they fear or like or think of the other being. When you cannot express yourself, you drop back into the animal skin. When wrapped up in an affect, sometimes you cannot present its inner core. It must first be differentiated and integrated before you can express its basic content. There are many ways of taking away the animal skin and bringing the human being back to human shape. Suppose it is vitally important that someone should express an affect or resistance to another person. Children must express resistances against parents and analyzans against the analyst. The whole question is whether it can be brought out in a human form, in which case it loses its wickedness, its sting, and its poison. If in a human way someone can say he does not like this or that, if it can be expressed decently, only an inhuman person would not accept it. But often one is caught in the affect, and then aggressiveness comes in. Sometimes analyzans are so afraid of their aggressiveness in expressing a resistance that they write it down, but that does not help. Because though they read it very nicely and humanely, the voice drops or something, and one knows that the aggressive affect is still there. The feeling below has not been dealt with, so that the analyst feels inhumanely attacked. The affect has not been overcome, when only the surface is humanized. The difficult thing is that one's resistance should be humanized right down to the physical vibration, not only veiled in a polite form. One can pretend that one was quite polite and not aggressive, but the affect makes the atmosphere bad, for both persons can feel it and the other gets the physical impact. The humanization of such an archetypal dynamism is an aspect of individuation, for it means its integration, becoming conscious of it, which is awfully difficult. Mythologically expressed, it is the great task of getting a bewitched person back into human shape, a redemption motif which you find in all mythologies. Sewing the star shirts, therefore, would mean working for many years in the deepest introversion and concentration in order to find the human way to let these irrational unconscious contents, or swans, reappear in human life in a way which does not shock or disintegrate the conscious world. It is the creative task. From a negative affect, what remains afterwards is a reasonable statement of a difference. Sometimes animus possession can be recognized, but sometimes at the bottom of one's criticism or resistance is a true state of oneself, when one can just agree to differ from the other person. Separation from the collective affect and its contagious effect is an aspect of individuation. It is also possible, however, to cheat oneself when one humanizes a resistance. I also have seen analyzans again and again cheat themselves in this way. They fight with animus and anima, abreact the emotion, then think they do not need to talk about it. But this is an illusion. One should say, last week I had a hell of a resistance, and in the end I saw that it was my own animus or anima. One should mention it. If you are in touch with somebody and hate that person for weeks, and then get over it, why not mention it? It is inhuman not to do so. In a resistance there is generally a great deal of projection, but the analyst has done something to earn it, and it is important that he should know what started the drama. If the analyzan speaks in the past sense, then the analyst can apologize, because although it is the analyzan's problem and now overcome, it is important to know what happened. Humanizing an animal or even bestial affect, or the civilized expression of negative opinions, is therefore an enormous task. It is the essence of culture.